Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. In today's episode, Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar will be joining me to discuss the latest developments in Turkish politics, and we'll also look at some top foreign policy events that have taken shape this week. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Gerilimlerin tırmandığı, sürekli yeni krizlerin baş gösterdiği bir dönemde Türkiye olarak adaleti, barışı, diplomasiyi öncelemeye devam edeceğiz.
Turkey's presidential cabinet convened under the chairmanship of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the capital of Ankara on Tuesday.
Türkiye her halükarda sulh-u sükûnun tarafındadır. Türkiye her komşusunun, her dostunun, her kardeşinin kendisinden emin olduğu bir ülkedir. Böyle bir devlettir.
Underscoring Turkey's resolute stance, Erdogan warned against testing the nation's patience or misjudging its calm approach.
Türkiye sınırları zorlanacak, dostluğu veya düşmanlığı test edilecek bir ülke de değildir. Biz istiklal ve istikbalimiz uğrunda gerekirse baş veririz ama asla zalime baş eğmeyiz.
Turning to Syria, the Turkish president issued a direct message to regional and international actors involved in the geopolitical situation.
Özellikle Suriye konusunda kimi aktörler Türkiye'nin sabır taşının direncini sınamak yerine dostluğunun kıymetini bilmeli, buna göre söylemlerini ve politikalarını ayarlamalı, örgüt gibi değil, devlet gibi hareket etmelidir.
He firmly warned that any attempts to obstruct Syria's path to peace and stability would be met with a united response from both the Turkish and Syrian governments.
Suriye'nin kalıcı huzura ve istikrara kavuşmasına kim engel olursa açık söylüyorum. Karşısında Suriye hükümetiyle birlikte bizi de bulacaktır. Terör koridoruyla Suriye'nin parçalanmasına nasıl müsaade etmediysek, başka koridorlarla bu ülkenin bölünmesine de aynı şekilde izin vermeyiz.
Welcome back to the program. Mustafa, now the Turkish cabinet meeting was held on Tuesday. There were many things that were discussed by the Turkish president. Syria was one of them, Russia was there, Ukraine was there, the Antalya diplomacy was there as well. Now, let's start with Syria, the statements that Turkish President Erdogan has made regarding Syria. He has said that if anyone tries to attack Syria, it will not just face the Syrian government, but the Turkish government as well. Tell me more about the statements from yesterday, Mustafa.
Turkey's presidential cabinet convened under the leadership of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan at the Beştepe presidential complex in the capital of Ankara yesterday. Turkish decision makers discussed internal and external challenges against Turkey's national security, exchanging views on the latest regional developments in the Middle East and global security challenges. Following the presidential cabinet meeting, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan addressed the nation, and he gave important messages to both regional and international stakeholders. He clearly reiterated Turkey's strong support for Syria's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. And President Erdogan clearly stated that no one should try to limit Turkey's friendship and animosity on the Syrian issue. As you know, geopolitical landscape changed in Syria in December. Country's long-time ruling family Assad family fled to Russia as the opposition forces led by Ahmet al-Shara took control of the country. And new era began for Syria and Syria's political future. Since the very beginning of the new era in Syria, Turkish decision makers have been reaffirming their country's strong support for political stability in Syria. And I think Turkey's growing influence in Syria is pushing Israel's buttons. As you know, Benjamin Netanyahu this month paid an official visit to the United States to meet with the United States President Donald Trump. He discussed many topics with Trump related to geopolitical developments and geopolitical challenges in the Middle East. And he clearly sought help from the United States to deal with bilateral disputes in Syria with Turkey. Within this context, Trump openly sided with Turkey and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in front of the international media at the Oval Office in the White House, and he called on the Israel's embattled Prime Minister to be reasonable to deal with Israel's problems with Turkey. I think Erdogan's latest message to Israel will pull Israeli decision makers together themselves, because any geopolitical tensions between Turkey and Israel, any geopolitical confrontation in Syria between Turkish and Israeli military forces, I think will increase the geopolitical tensions in the Middle East furthermore.
Mustafa, you've talked about confrontations. If you look at this region, there's the war in Gaza, then there's the war in Yemen, now there's no war in Syria, but in the last 10 years, what we've seen was chaos, was a crisis that the regime leader Bashar al-Assad was leading. Now, Erdogan has said that whatever happens in the Middle East directly affects Turkey, Turkish people, its security and its economy. Obviously, Turkey is in such a region. For example, you have Greece, there are tensions as well over there. You have the border areas, you have Iran. So geopolitically and geographically, Turkey is in such a position where it is being faced with constant threats on a daily basis. Now, when he says that whatever happens in the Middle East directly affects Turkey, you agree with me, we agree with the president. The wars, the refugees, the asylum seekers, a lot of people are going to come to Turkey. So tell me, in what other ways do the developments in the Middle East impact Turkey?
Umar, Turkey is an indispensable part of the Middle East region. Turkey has been enjoying close relationships nearly with all countries in the region. But Israel's recent military aggressions in the occupied Palestinian territories in Lebanon or in Yemen is increasing geopolitical tensions for all the regional stakeholders in the Middle East. Turkey is always prioritizing diplomacy and dialogue to deal with the bilateral or multilateral disputes in the Middle East. But Israel is turning a blind eye to demands coming from the regional countries in the Middle East to reach long-standing peace and stability. Within this context, Israel is trying to expand its hegemonic agenda in the Middle East. Israel, as you also know, is targeting Syria's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. In December, with the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime in this war-torn country, I think Israeli decision makers started to think that there will be a geopolitical vacuum in southern Syria, and they started to take advantage of the latest situation in Syria. They are trying to expand their territorial gains in Syria. Turkey is clearly warning against Israel's provocative actions in the Middle East. As you also said, there is ongoing war between Israel and Palestinian resistance group Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Since the very beginning of the crisis, Turkey is leading the international community to increase awareness about Israel's ethnic cleansing policies in the occupied Palestinian territories. Turkey is always pushing for diplomacy and is calling upon the international community to increase campaign pressure against Israel to convince the Israeli decision makers to halt their aggression and ambition in the Middle East. Within this context, I think Turkey will be accelerating its diplomatic efforts to stop Israel's military aggression in the region. I think all the international community, especially the Western countries, should be in cooperation with Turkey to bring long-lasting peace and tranquility to the Middle East.
Mustafa, peace and tranquility, these are two things that world leaders are also trying to find in Ukraine and in Russia. The war in Ukraine has been continuing for over 3 years. Now we're in the 4th year. Tell me the current stance of the Turkish president and Turkish officials on the war in Ukraine. We know that there have been negotiations. There was a deal which was recently signed in Saudi Arabia. Turkey hosted Russian and American officials last week as well to talk about their diplomatic ties and normalization. So what is Turkey's stance at this point? What is Turkey? Erdogan said yesterday as well, I would like to remind our audiences, he said that Turkey is ready to host another round of talks or take necessary measures in order to end the war. So what is Turkey's latest stance on the war in Ukraine?
Omar, Russia launched its so-called special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022. And since the very beginning of the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, Turkey has been taking steps to prioritize diplomacy and dialogue between the two warring sides in the region to reach a ceasefire and to put an end to the ongoing conflicts. Within this context, as you know, Turkey and the United Nations mediated between Ukraine and Russia to reach Black Sea grain initiatives. And it helped poor countries alleviate the food crisis in the global south. Within this context, as you know, Turkey is always cooperating and collaborating with both Ukraine and Russia to increase its bilateral relationships with its neighbors in the Black Sea region. Turkey is always reiterating its strong support for geopolitical stability in the Black Sea region. Turkey is hosting right now a Black Sea meeting among regional stakeholders to discuss what can be done in terms of upholding peace and security in the region. As you know, Donald Trump took to the Oval Office in January to start his second presidency term. And since then, United States has been accelerating its diplomatic efforts to bring together Ukraine and Russia to stop the ongoing war in Eastern Europe. But Trump's actions is raising concerns among United States' traditional allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization about the U.S. commitment to Europe's security. And Turkey is always calling upon European nations to increase their cooperation with Turkey in terms of ensuring peace and stability in the old continent. Within this context, as you know, Saudi Arabia hosted negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, between Ukraine and the United States, and between Russia and the United States. Trump is trying to normalize the United States relationships with Russia. And second phase of normalization talks between United States and Russia was held in Turkey's financial and cultural capital, Istanbul, last week. And Turkey will increase its cooperation with all regional and international stakeholders to bring long-lasting peace and stability in the Eastern Europe. I think Turkey's increasing political influence and geopolitical influence in the region will yield positive results to ensure both regional peace and security in the Middle East and international tranquility.
That was Mustafa Kocakanar's analysis about the Turkish cabinet meeting that was held yesterday. Now we're going to talk about the F-35 jets, Greece and Israel. But first, let's take a look at this news report.
United States is reportedly considering the possibility of reintegrating Türkiye into the F-35 fighter jet program, reversing a decision made in 2019 after Ankara's acquisition of the Russian S-400 air defense systems. The potential deal could see the delivery of advanced fighter jets to Türkiye, provided the country takes measures to render the S-400 systems inoperable, such as dismantling or relocating them to a U.S.-controlled base in Adana. This new development follows a phone call between President Donald Trump and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which has sparked renewed momentum for negotiations surrounding the F-35 jets. Sources suggest that the Trump administration has directed legal and technical reviews to explore how to lift the sanctions imposed under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act and reinitiate F-35 deliveries to Türkiye. While Türkiye remains optimistic, the potential deal has raised concerns in Israel. Israel's primary concern lies in the possibility of Türkiye acquiring advanced weaponry amid existing regional tensions, and there are fears that this could shift the balance of power in the Middle East. Israeli officials are also worried that the F-35 sale could allow Türkiye to improve its military capabilities, which could complicate Israel's strategic position in the region. Additionally, Greece, which is planning to acquire its own fleet of F-35 jets, has expressed unease over Türkiye's possible return to the program. The Greek government has raised objections, with foreign policymakers reportedly discussing the issue with their Israeli and American counterparts. Despite the opposition from Israel and Greece, President Trump has indicated that he could move forward with the sale.
Welcome back to the program. Now, Mustafa, the F-35 jets issue has been a problematic aspect of the ties between Turkey and the United States. Turkey was a part of the F-35 jets program, but was then removed in 2019. And let me tell you about a statement that the United States issued after Turkey was removed. The F-35 cannot coexist with a Russian intelligence collection platform that will be used to learn about its advanced capabilities. Firstly, tell me about the origins of the F-35 program, Mustafa.
Mar, if you want to understand the current situation between the United States and Turkey about F-35 stealth fighter jets, I think we have to delve into the origins of the problems between two countries. As we know, Turkey was one of the most important contributors to F-35 stealth fighter jet program. Turkey was producing some important elements for F-35 fighter jets. But during the Obama administration, there was a civil war in Syria. And Turkey was asking and seeking air defense equipment from its Western allies, particularly within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And except Spain, Western nations refused to give Patriot air defense systems to Turkey to protect itself against security threats coming from the northern Syria. And within this context, Turkish decision makers started to look another options to increase its air defense capabilities against internal and external security threats. And Turkey and Russia reached an agreement over the sale of S-400 air defense systems to Turkey. And during the first administration of Donald Trump, United States excluded Turkey from the F-35 stealth fighter jet program, citing its concerns over Turkey's acquirement of S-400 air defense systems from Russia. United States claimed that if you are purchasing and acquiring military equipment from our adversaries, we can impose sanctions on you under the name of CAATSA. CAATSA means countering American adversaries through Sanctions Act. And they excluded Turkey from the F-35 stealth fighter jets program. During the Biden administration, Turkey and the United States established strategic cooperation mechanism to deal with their bilateral disputes over F-35 stealth fighter jets program. And Turkey is also seeking F-16 modernizing kits from the United States. And with the start of the Trump administration in the United States, Erdogan and other Turkish decision makers, especially Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, engaged high-level security and military talks with their American counterparts to cope with the bilateral disputes between two important NATO allies. Within this context, last month, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan held a phone conversation with his American counterpart Donald Trump to discuss what can be done to strengthen bilateral military cooperation between Ankara and Washington. And following these phone conversations and meetings between Turkish and American decision makers, American journalists and American news makers started to publish news article about Turkey's reinstatement to F-35 stealth fighter jets program. And as we know that right now President Donald Trump is exploring ways and opportunities to sell F-35 jets to Turkey, I think President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is preparing to pay an official visit to the United States. And I hope that during this upcoming meeting, Ankara and Washington will be able to finalize the F-35 stalemate between two NATO allies, and it will increase the military cooperation between two important NATO allies.
Mustafa, from what you've told me, the prospects look good. Turkey would be able to buy the F-35 jets. But let's take a look at the events that have taken place over the last 2 months, let's say. Hakan Fidan has met Marco Rubio at many different events, the Munich Security Conference, and then in Brussels at the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting. President Erdogan is scheduled. We don't know a clear date yet. He's expected to visit the United States. And Hakan Fidan was in Washington and in New York a couple of weeks ago, and he met Marco Rubio over there as well. Now, we know that the situation, the relationship between Turkey and the United States is going well. But Israel and Netanyahu have been lobbying to deny Turkey these F-35 jets. They would rather give those jets to Greece, which is a rival of Turkey. But now, tell me, I have 2 questions. Number 1, do you believe that Turkey is close to obtaining these jets? And number 2, if Turkey gets these jets, what will the Russian response be?
Well, first of all, I have to say that Turkish and American decision makers are right now trying to mend the bilateral ties between their countries. And I think special relationships between Trump and Erdogan will help both nations enhance their bilateral cooperation. As you know, President Trump publicly calls Turkish leader Erdogan a smart guy and a tough politician in the international diplomacy. But on the other hand, there are also some issues poisoning the bilateral relationships between two important NATO allies. One of them is United States' ongoing support for PKK terrorist organizations, Syria and offshoot, PYD, YPG. Turkey is always calling upon the United States to cut its ties with PKK terrorist group, Syria and offshoot, PYD, YPG. On the other hand, as we know that Members of the Gülenist terror group are still operating in the United States. Its ringleader, Fethullah Gülen, died last year, but its members are still active within the territory of the United States. I think they are poisoning bilateral relationships between Turkey and the United States. I think Erdogan and Trump will be able to cope with bilateral disputes between their countries. But as you also say, there is another dimension of this topic. Israel is lobbying against Turkey's reinstatement to F-35 stealth fighter jets program, because Israeli decision makers clearly think that if Turkey gets F-35 stealth fighter jets from the United States, these jets will give air superiority in the Middle East region. And it is raising alarms among Israeli decision makers. But Israel is not only lobbying against Turkey's F-35 acquirement. Greece is also lobbying against Turkey's national security engagements with the United States. Whenever Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis pays an official visit to abroad, he is always urging Western countries not to increase their defense cooperation with Turkey. And as you know, at the end of March, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis visited Israel's Tel Aviv to meet with Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They discussed their bilateral relationships and geopolitical developments in the Middle East. And we know that they exchange views on Turkey's increasing geopolitical and political influence in the Middle East. I think right now Greece and Israel are cooperating together to obstruct Turkey's acquirement of F-35 stealth fighter jets program. But I have to clearly say that if Turkey strengthens its military capabilities in the Middle East or in Europe, I don't think that it will pose a huge threat to Israel's national security or Greece's geopolitical position in Europe. Strengthening Turkey's military capabilities, I think, will only enhance and uphold international peace and stability and security.
Mustafa, that was an excellent analysis of what we've been seeing over the past few weeks and some of the most pressing topics that are related to Turkey. Now we're going to be talking about the relationship between Greece and Turkey, and once we come back, we're going to discuss these topics in detail. But first, let's take a look at the news report.
Welcome.
How are you?
Fine.
Very good
And
to
you?
see you. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me.
Relations with Greece are among the most significant components of Turkey's foreign policy. Both nations are NATO allies, sharing geographical proximity and common democratic values. However, Turkey and Greece face multiple unresolved issues in the Aegean and Mediterranean, many of which stem from historical disputes. Various long-standing tensions have placed Turkey and Greece at odds over the past several decades. Territorial disputes in the eastern Mediterranean, including airspace, energy resources, the status of certain Aegean islands, and Cyprus, have strained relations between the two NATO allies. The presence of disputes in the Aegean is an undeniable reality, already recognized by the international community. Addressing only a single issue while disregarding others, or advocating a selective approach to conflict resolution, is not a viable strategy for achieving a comprehensive and peaceful settlement. Such an approach would inevitably leave unresolved issues unaddressed. With this perspective, Turkey maintains that all disputes should be tackled collectively to ensure lasting peace. Within this framework, Turkey reaffirms its commitment, in good faith, to strengthening bilateral relations and working towards resolving outstanding disputes.
Welcome back to the program. Now, Mustafa, another important thing that we were discussing earlier as well was the relationship between Turkey and Greece. Tell me about the problems that both of these countries are facing. There's migration, there's defense, there's so many issues, political, economic. Tell me about those issues. Tell me the problems that are being faced by both countries right now.
Umar, Turkey and Greece are sharing the same geography and same history. But on the other hand, there are several complex issues poisoning the bilateral relationships between Ankara and Athens. And within this context, some bilateral disputes have been putting two important NATO allies against each other in recent year. And as you know, there are some problems between Turkey and Greece in the Aegean Sea. According to bilateral agreements between Turkey and Greece, Greece is not supposed to take any military actions on the demilitarized islands in the Aegean Sea. But as we know that Greece is continuing to deploy military equipment to the demilitarized status of islands, and it is clearly violating the bilateral agreements between Turkey and Greece. It is also increasing tensions among two important NATO allies. At the weekend, Greece Commander-in-Chief reiterated his country's determination to protect its national security in the Aegean Sea against so-called threats coming from Turkey. And he clearly said that Greece will intervene within 5 minutes if something gets worse for Greece's national security. It is clearly threatening Turkey's position in the Aegean Sea. On the other hand, there are also some important and complex disputes between Turkey and the United States related to Eastern Mediterranean. And Turkey is increasing its cooperation with Libya, and Turkey signed important agreements with Libya to fairly share the natural resources in the region. And it is sparking fears within Greece about Turkey's growing geopolitical influence in the region. And Greece is taking its own steps with Israel to obstruct Turkey's initiatives in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey is always calling for good neighborly relationships with all neighbors, but it doesn't mean that Turkey will allow any fait accompli in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Aegean Sea. I think Greece should pull itself together to increase its bilateral cooperation with Turkey to deal with the common security challenges in the region.
Mustafa, now, like you just mentioned, Turkey says that both of these countries should have good neighborly relations. Now, these countries are a part of NATO as well. They have good relations with European countries as well, not only in Europe but also in the Middle East. So what's preventing these two countries to join hands, join forces? Why are there still fights? We know there's a TRNC issue. We know there's migration, like I just mentioned before. So why aren't other actors trying to mediate between Greece and Turkey?
Mar, when we talk about bilateral disputes between Turkey and Greece, I think we should touch upon the Cyprus issue. As you know, Turkish military forces started Cyprus peace operation in 1974 to protect Turkish Cypriots living on the island against Greek Cypriots atrocities. And then at the beginning of 1980s, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus declared its independence. Since then, international community is increasing its pressure over Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And except Turkey, right now, no one is recognizing the sovereignty of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Within this context, Turkey is always pushing for the recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus by the international community. But Greece and Greek Cypriots are lobbying against Turkey's legitimate demands in the Eastern Mediterranean. As you know, in 2004, European Union unilaterally accepted Greek Cypriots to the Union. It clearly violates the sovereignty of Turkish Cypriot people living on the island. And right now, no one is recognizing the sovereignty of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. On the other hand, as you know, Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar has been always calling for the sovereign equality between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, because he claims that right now on the island there are two separate nations. One nation is Greek Cypriot and the second nation is Turkish Cypriot. Within this context, Turkey and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus are working for the two-state solution on the island. But on the other hand, Greek side is always insisting on failed federal state on the island. But history shows that federalism didn't work on the island, and in the future it will not work. I think international community should take Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus legitimate demands into the consideration and should give their support for the peaceful resolution to the issue. I think Turkey will continue to push its diplomatic actions and efforts to ensure the recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus by the international community. To sum up, I can say that Azerbaijan will help Turkey legitimize Turkish Cypriot people's legitimate national demands on the island.
Mustafa, since we're talking about the TRNC, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, there was a summit held earlier this month where the European Union met Central Asian states. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan have endorsed UN resolutions which declare the TRNC's independence as illegitimate. How is Turkey reacting to this?
Umar, unfortunately, some Turkic countries in Central Asia, as you say, endorsed the United Nations Security Council resolutions on the Cyprus issue. As you know, Turkey has cultural, linguistic, and political, economic, military ties with all Turkic states in the Central Asia region. Turkey is always reiterating its strong support for these countries' political stability and economic prosperity. But on the other hand, as we know, European Union and Central Asian countries held important summit in Uzbekistan's Samarkand at the beginning of this month, and they started to engage political talks with Greek Cypriot administration. Diplomatic sources confirmed that these countries are sending their ambassadors to Greek Cypriot administration. And as you know, there is also organization of Turkic states. Turkey is trying to expand its bilateral or multilateral cooperation with these countries on all fields thanks to organization of Turkic state organization. And Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is also participating in annual summits held by the organization of Turkic states. I think these countries should reverse their decisions about Greek Cypriot administration, and I think Azerbaijan can play an important role between Turkey and other Turkic states located in the Central Asia deal with the Cyprus issue, and I hope in the foreseeing future all these countries should recognize the independence of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and should they give their strong support for the legitimate demands of the Turkish Cypriot people in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Mustafa Kocakanar, thank you for your analysis. As always, it's a pleasure having you on the program and talking about the most pressing topics that are surrounding Turkey and the entire region as well.
You are welcome, Omar. Thank you for hosting me.
That brings us to the end of today's episode of Turkey's Diplomacy. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the key developments shaping the country. Catch us in the next episode for more insights, analyses, and conversations that matter. Bye for now.